Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. We place our collective faith in the justice system to find the truth and deliver a just verdict. But this system is a human construct, and therefore, it is fallible. A wrongful conviction is one of its most devastating failures, a life irrevocably altered, years stolen, and the very foundation of justice shaken. Today, we delve into the anatomy of such a tragedy, the missteps, the flawed evidence, and the haunting reality of an innocent person's fight for freedom. This is what happens when the system fails. Case 1. The Norfolk Four, a contagion of lies. In the ecosystem of a community, there exists an unspoken trust, a belief that behind the doors of our neighbors, ordinary life unfolds. But on the evening of July 8, 1997, in the Ocean View neighborhood of Norfolk, Virginia, that trust was irrevocably broken. The life of 21-year-old Michelle Morbosco did not just end. It was violently extinguished in the one place she should have been safest, her own home. Her husband, a young Navy sailor named Billy Bosco, had been at sea for several days. He returned to their second-floor apartment, expecting a warm embrace. Instead, he was met with a chilling silence. He called her name. There was no answer. He walked through the small apartment, a sense of unease growing with every step. In the bedroom, he found her. The scene was one of unimaginable violence. Michelle had been raped and stabbed to death. The Norfolk Police Department descended upon the scene. The initial investigation was a study in frustration. There were no signs of forced entry, suggesting Michelle may have known her killer. The apartment was chaotic, but yielded little in the way of forensic evidence. No foreign fingerprints of value, no clear murder weapon left behind. The pressure to solve such a brutal crime in a tight-knit military community was immense. The public demanded answers. The police needed a suspect. Their attention soon turned to a neighbor. Danielle Williams, a 27-year-old sailor who lived in the same building. He was known to be socially awkward, a bit of a loner. To the police, in the absence of evidence, personality can become a substitute for suspicion. A few neighbors mentioned that Williams had seemed overly interested in the case, asking questions. In the vacuum of a stalled investigation, this sliver of perceived strangeness was enough. On July 11th, detectives brought Danielle Williams in for questioning. He went voluntarily, believing he was helping the investigation. He had no idea he was walking into a psychological crucible from which his life would never truly escape. The man leading the interrogation was Detective Robert Glenn Ford. Ford was a seasoned investigator, known for his ability to elicit confessions. His methods were a masterclass in psychological coercion, a textbook application of techniques designed to break a person's will. Williams was placed in a small, windowless room. The questioning began. For hours, Williams maintained his innocence. He had an alibi. He was at work, then at home. He knew nothing about the murder. Detective Ford was patient, relentless. He employed a strategy of minimization, suggesting he understood that Williams didn't mean for it to happen. Maybe you just went over there to talk, he might have offered, and things got out of hand. This creates a false, more palatable version of events, making confessions seem less monstrous. When that failed, the pressure escalated. Ford began to lie. He told Williams that his fingerprints were found at the scene. This was false. He told him that a witness saw him there. This was false. He administered a polygraph test and, regardless of the results, informed Williams that he had failed spectacularly. The machine doesn't lie, Ford asserted, cementing the idea that his guilt was a scientific fact and his denials were futile. The hours bled together. Williams was deprived of sleep, food, and contact with the outside world. His reality began to warp. Isolated and exhausted, His mind became a fertile ground for suggestion. The details of the crime, which he could not have known, were fed to him by the detectives themselves. They would ask leading questions. Did you use a knife from her kitchen? Was she wearing a blue shirt? Confused and desperate to appease his interrogators, Williams began to incorporate these planted details into a narrative. His own memory, once firm, was now a fog. The truth became whatever the detectives told him it was. After more than 9 hours of this relentless psychological battery, Danielle Williams broke. He confessed. But it was not a coherent narrative. It was a disjointed, contradictory mess, patched together from the fragments of information Ford had supplied. He said he had acted alone. For the police, this was a victory. The case was closed. But Detective Ford wasn't satisfied. He believed a crime this violent must have involved more than one person. And so, the interrogation continued. He pressured Williams to name accomplices. Exhausted, pliable, and now committed to a story that was not his own, Williams did as he was told. He named his roommate and fellow sailor, Joseph Dick Jr. Joseph Dick was a different personality from Williams. He was more confident, more assertive. When detectives brought him in, he was indignant. He denied any involvement, and his denial was fierce. But he was subjected to the same systematic dismantling of his will. The same small room, the same long hours, the same lies. They told Dick that Danielle Williams had confessed and implicated him completely. They told him his DNA was found at the scene. They told him he would face the death penalty if he didn't cooperate, but if he confessed, they could help him. The interrogation lasted for nearly 8 hours. Dick, like Williams, was worn down. The certainty of his own innocence began to crack under the weight of the detective's manufactured evidence. He saw no way out. He, too, began to confess, weaving a story that corroborated the fiction created by Williams, adding his own confused details. The contagion of the false confession had spread. Now the police had a new narrative, a group conspiracy. In his coerced statement, Joseph Dick, under pressure to name more accomplices, pointed to another sailor he knew, Derek Tice. Derek Tice was stationed in Florida at the time of the murder. He had a solid alibi. But he had previously lived in Norfolk and knew Williams and Dick. For Detective Ford, this was enough. Tice was extradited to Virginia and placed in the same interrogation room. He was subjected to the same psychological onslaught. He was told Williams and Dick had confessed and named him as the ringleader. He was threatened with capital murder charges. He was interrogated for days, with the sessions lasting up to 14 hours. Tice, a man with no criminal history, eventually succumbed. His confession was even more problematic, filled with inconsistencies that directly contradicted the crime scene and the other statements. He claimed the men had entered through a window, but there was no forced entry. He described the victims' clothing incorrectly. The police, however, were not looking for consistency. They were looking for confirmation. The circle of false guilt continued to widen. The 3 men, now trapped in a shared delusion crafted by the police, implicated a 4th sailor, Eric Wilson. Wilson, like the others, was innocent, but like the others, he was brought in, isolated, and systematically broken down. He was told that 3 other men had already confessed and that his denial was pointless. He was shown their signed statements. The evidence of his guilt seemed overwhelming, not because it was real, but because the system presented it as such. After hours of pressure, Eric Wilson also confessed. The police now had what they wanted, for confessions from 4 sailors, painting a lurid tale of a group of men who conspired to rape and murder Michelle Morbosco. The media dubbed them the Norfolk Four. The city of Norfolk breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monsters had been caught. The system had worked. But the system was not working. It was failing in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The entire case was built on a foundation of psychological manipulation, lies, and contaminated confessions. There was not a single piece of physical evidence connecting any of the four men to the crime scene. The DNA collected from the victim belonged to an unknown male. It did not match Williams, Dick, Tice, or Wilson. This glaring discrepancy was explained away by the prosecution with a chillingly convenient theory. There must have been another, fifth participant, the one who left the DNA, who the four men were protecting. The confessions, they argued, were so detailed that they had to be true. The jury was never fully informed of the coercive nature of the interrogations. They were presented with signed and videotaped statements where the men recited the facts of the crime. To a layperson, it looked like undeniable proof of guilt. The trials were a formality. Danielle Williams and Joseph Dick were convicted of rape and murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Derek Tice, considered the ringleader by the prosecution, was sentenced to 2 life terms. Eric Wilson, who had been the last to confess, was convicted only of rape, as his story was the most inconsistent, and he was sentenced to 8.5 years. The 4 men were sent to prison for a crime they did not commit. They were vilified, their names synonymous with a brutal act of violence. They lost their careers, their families, and their futures. Inside the walls of Virginia's prisons, they maintained their innocence to anyone who would listen, but their voices were drowned out by the finality of a jury's verdict. The case of Michelle Morbosco was considered closed. But the truth has a strange persistence. It can be buried, distorted, and ignored, but it rarely vanishes completely. In 1999, 2 years after the convictions, a piece of correspondence arrived at the Norfolk Commonwealth's attorney's office. It was a letter from an inmate in a Virginia prison named Omar Ballard. Ballard was a career criminal, serving time for a series of unrelated violent assaults. In the letter, he claimed that he and he alone had raped and murdered Michelle Morbosco. At first, the authorities were dismissive. Confessions from serving prisoners are not uncommon. They can be attempts to gain notoriety or disrupt the system. But Ballard's confession was different. He provided details about the crime that had never been made public, details that only the true killer could know. He described the layout of the apartment with perfect accuracy. He knew what Michelle was wearing. He described the specific sequence of events, the nature of the wounds, the location of the murder weapon on knife from her own kitchen block, which he had wiped clean and replaced. His account was chilling, coherent, and, unlike the confessions of the Norfolk Four, it matched the physical evidence precisely. He explained that he had entered the apartment through the unlocked front door, hoping to steal money for drugs. When Michelle discovered him, he attacked her. He acted alone. He had never met, nor even heard of, Danielle Williams, Joseph Dick, Derek Tice, or Eric Wilson. The most crucial step was taken next. A sample of Omar Ballard's DNA was tested against the semen recovered from the crime scene. It was a perfect match. This was not just a crack in the case against the Norfolk Four. It was a seismic event that should have shattered it completely. Here was the man whose DNA was at the scene, confessing in vivid detail, his story aligning perfectly with the forensic evidence. The innocence of the 4 sailors was no longer a matter of opinion or protest. It was a matter of scientific and evidentiary fact. But the system, having invested so much in its original narrative, refused to yield. The prosecutors and police had built their careers on these convictions. To admit they had coerced confessions from 4 innocent men and sent them to prison while the real killer remained free was an admission of failure on a scale that was, for them, unthinkable. Instead of exonerating the Norfolk Four, the prosecution engaged in a stunning series of mental gymnastics. They concocted a new theory. They argued that Omar Ballard must have been the fifth participant, the one whose DNA was left behind. They claimed that the four sailors had lied about his involvement to protect him, even though they had no connection to him. They clung to the coerced confessions, arguing that they were still valid, despite being contradicted by every piece of physical evidence and the confession of the actual perpetrator. Omar Ballard was convicted of the murder of Michelle Morbosco and sentenced to life in prison. But the Norfolk Four remained behind bars. The system chose to believe in a fantastical conspiracy involving 5, then 6, then even 7 men, rather than accept the simple, horrifying truth that they had convicted 4 innocent people. The fight for the men's freedom became a long, arduous war of attrition. Teams of pro bono lawyers, innocence projects, and investigative journalists took up their cause. They meticulously deconstructed the interrogations, showing frame by frame how the detectives had planted every crucial fact. They highlighted the dozens of inconsistencies in the men's statements. They presented the irrefutable DNA evidence. For years, the state of Virginia resisted. Appeals were denied. Petitions were rejected. The system protected its own, even in the face of overwhelming evidence of a grave injustice. The 4 men languished in prison, their youth fading into the monotonous routine of incarceration. Eric Wilson served his full sentence and was released in 2005, but as a convicted felon, his life was forever marked. Finally, in 2009, after a decade of relentless legal battles and mounting public pressure, Governor Tim Kaine granted conditional pardons to Williams, Dick, and Tice. The pardons freed them from prison, but did not wipe their records clean. They were released back into a world that had moved on without them, still carrying the stigma of convictions for a crime they had no part in. It would take another 8 years for the final measure of justice to be delivered. In 2017, after the case was re-examined under a new governor, Terry McAuliffe, and after the original detective, Robert Ford, had been convicted in federal court on unrelated charges of extortion and lying to the FBI, the truth was finally officially acknowledged. Governor McAuliffe granted absolute pardons to all 4 men, declaring their unequivocal innocence. The state of Virginia paid them a settlement for the years stolen from their lives. 20 years. That is the length of time that passed between the night Michelle Morbosco was murdered and the day the 4 men falsely accused of the crime were fully cleared. Danielle Williams spent nearly 12 years in prison. Joseph Dick, 11 years. Derek Tice, 11 years. Eric Wilson served over 7. The case of the Norfolk Four serves as a chilling testament to the terrifying power of a false confession. It reveals a fundamental flaw in our understanding of human psychology. We want to believe that no one would confess to a crime they did not commit. But under conditions of extreme stress, fatigue, and sophisticated manipulation, the human mind can be made to betray itself. Memory can be contaminated, and the will to resist can be eroded until a lie feels like the only available truth. It is a story about a contagion, where one lie, told by a detective in a small room, infected another person and then another and another, creating an epidemic of false guilt. The system did not just fail to find the truth. It actively manufactured a lie and then defended that lie for 2 decades, sacrificing the lives of 4 innocent men in the process. Their ordeal forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question: how many other confessions, locked away in evidence files, are not a record of guilt, but merely an echo of an interrogator's voice? Case 2. Kirk Bloodsworth, convicted by a sketch. There is a particular quiet that belongs to a weekday afternoon in the suburbs during summer. It is a peace born from routine, the knowledge that children are at play, that life is proceeding along its predictable and gentle course. In this quiet, there is an assumption of safety. It was this assumption that was shattered in Rosedale, Maryland, on a day that began with the warmth and promise of late July. 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton was playing with her friends, her world contained within the safe boundaries of her own neighborhood. When she did not return home, a small knot of concern in her mother's stomach slowly tightened into a knot of pure dread. A search began, first by family, then by neighbors, and finally by police. The suburban quiet was broken by panicked calls and the sweep of flashlights cutting through the dusk. The search ended a few hours later in a densely wooded area not far from Dawn's home. What a searcher found there would forever scar the community's memory. The body of Dawn Hamilton was lying among the trees. She had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death with a rock. The crime was an anomaly of pure evil in a place that believed itself immune to such things. The pressure on the Baltimore County Police was immediate and intense. They had to find the monster who had done this. The investigation began with the only leads they had, the accounts of 2 young boys who had been playing with Dawn shortly before she disappeared. The boys, both children themselves, reported seeing a man with Dawn, leading her into the woods. Their descriptions were, as one might expect from terrified children, vague and somewhat contradictory. They described a man who was tall, wiry, with curly, bushy blonde hair and a mustache. Based on these fractured memories, a police artist created a composite sketch. It was the face of a phantom, a generic rendering of a man with shaggy hair and a mustache. The sketch was broadcast on local news stations, printed in newspapers, and plastered on telephone poles. The police urged the public, "Look at this face. Do you know this man?" In the vast and anxious audience of the evening news, someone did. Or rather, they thought they did. An anonymous phone call came into the police department. The caller had seen the sketch on television and said it resembled their neighbor, Kirk Bloodsworth. Kirk Bloodsworth was 22 years old, a former Marine, honorably discharged. He was a fisherman, a waterman, who lived a quiet life with his wife. He was a large man, powerfully built, standing 6 feet 5 inches tall. He had red hair, not blonde, and at the time, he was clean-shaven. He looked, in reality, nothing like the wiry, blonde-haired man from the children's initial descriptions. But he did bear a passing, generic resemblance to the ambiguous drawing on the television screen. That was enough. The anonymous tip, a product of pure speculation, was all it took to turn the full, undivided attention of the Baltimore County Police onto Kirk Bloodsworth. The investigation, which had been a search for an unknown predator, now became a mission to confirm a single suspect. This is a subtle but critical shift in policing. It is the beginning of confirmation bias, where evidence is no longer gathered to find the truth, but to fit a pre-existing theory. Detectives began to construct a case. They built it not on a foundation of physical evidence, for there was none linking Bloodsworth to the crime, but on the most malleable and unreliable form of proof: eyewitness identification. They brought in the 2 young boys who had been with Dawn. They were shown a photo array that included Kirk Bloodsworth's picture. One of the boys picked out Bloodsworth's photo, but was uncertain. The other boy picked out a different person entirely. The initial results were inconclusive, a failure. But the police were not deterred. Days later, they conducted a live lineup. Kirk Bloodsworth stood on a stage with several other men. This time, after being unable to identify him from a photograph, one of the boys pointed to Bloodsworth. The other remained uncertain. The power of suggestion in a lineup, especially with child witnesses, cannot be overstated. The child knows the police believe the killer is in the line. They feel an immense pressure to make a choice, to be the one who helps catch the bad man. The slightest nonverbal cue from an officer, an extended glance at one suspect, can be enough to sway a fragile, uncertain memory. The police then located 3 other potential witnesses. One was a man who, from a distance, saw someone he couldn't identify near the woods. Another was a neighbor who saw a man walking down the street around the time of the crime. A third was a store clerk who claimed to have sold a pack of cigarettes to Bloodsworth on that day. Initially, none of their descriptions had matched Bloodsworth. They described a man significantly shorter and lighter than he was. But now, presented with Bloodsworth as the primary suspect, their memories began to change. They were shown his photograph. They saw him in person. Their recollections sharpened, retroactively fitting the man the police had put in front of them. At trial, all 5 witnesses would point a finger at Kirk Bloodsworth, their initial uncertainties and contradictions erased, replaced by a confident, damning certainty. The prosecution now had its narrative, a chain of witnesses who placed Kirk Bloodsworth with Dawn Hamilton just before her death. Bloodsworth was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, rape, and sexual assault. He was bewildered, terrified. He insisted he was innocent. He had an alibi. On the day of the murder, he had been at home with his wife, painting and working around their small apartment. But an alibi provided by a spouse is often the weakest defense, easily dismissed by a jury as self-serving. The trial began in March of 1985. The prosecution's case was simple and powerful. One by one, the 5 witnesses took the stand. The 2 young boys, now coached and confident, identified Kirk Bloodsworth as the man who led Dawn into the woods. The other 3 witnesses testified they saw him in the area. The prosecutor painted Bloodsworth as a monster hiding in plain sight, a predator who had lured an innocent child to her death. Bloodsworth's defense attorney did his best to chip away at the fortress of eyewitness testimony. He highlighted the inconsistencies in their initial descriptions, the discrepancies in height, weight, and hair color. He pointed out the flawed and suggestive nature of the identification procedures. He put Kirk's wife on the stand to provide his alibi. But it was not enough. To the jury, the sight of 2 young boys pointing at the defendant was emotionally overwhelming. It seemed inconceivable that they could all be wrong. The lack of any physical evidence, no fingerprints, no fibers, no hair, no blood connecting Bloodsworth to the victim or the crime scene was overshadowed by the seeming certainty of human memory. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict came back, guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the sentence was read. For the rape and murder of Dawn Hamilton, Kirk Bloodsworth was sentenced to death. He would be executed in Maryland's gas chamber. Bloodsworth collapsed, a giant of a man reduced to a state of utter shock and disbelief. He was an innocent man, a former Marine who had served his country, and he was going to be put to death for a crime he had only learned about on the news. The system, in which he had been raised to believe, had not just failed him, it had condemned him. Life on death row is a unique form of psychological torture. It is a world stripped of time, a purgatory where every day is a slow march towards a state-sanctioned death. Bloodsworth was housed in a tiny cell at the Maryland Penitentiary. He was surrounded by the truly guilty, men who had committed heinous crimes. Yet he was the one who was innocent. The irony was a constant, gnawing presence. He maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen: guards, fellow inmates, the occasional journalist. But in the eyes of the law, he was a convicted child killer. His appeals were procedural, focusing on legal errors, not on the fundamental question of his guilt. His conviction was, in fact, overturned on a technicality: the prosecution had illegally withheld potentially exculpatory evidence related to another suspect, but this was only a temporary reprieve. He was granted a new trial in 1987. It was a near replica of the first. The same witnesses, their memories now even more ingrained, took the stand and pointed him out with the same unwavering confidence. The same lack of physical evidence. The same result.
Guilty.
This time, however, he was spared the death penalty. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. He would die in prison just more slowly. For Kirk Bloodsworth, this was not a victory. It was a different kind of death sentence. He was being buried alive by the system. It was in the bleak confines of the prison library that he found a flicker of hope. He began to read, devouring law books, trying to find a way, any way, to prove his innocence. It was there that he came across an article describing a revolutionary new forensic technique being pioneered in Great Britain by a scientist named Alec Jeffreys. It was called DNA fingerprinting. The article described how every individual possesses a unique genetic code found in their DNA. This code could be extracted from biological material, blood, hair, semen, and used to identify a person with near-perfect accuracy. Bloodsworth read the words, and for the first time in years, he felt something other than despair. He realized that the evidence that could prove his innocence might have existed all along, preserved on the victim's clothing, waiting for science to catch up. The biological evidence from the crime scene, including semen stains found on Don Hamilton's underwear, had been preserved. This evidence contained the DNA of the real killer. If that DNA did not match his, it would be irrefutable proof of his innocence. The fight to get the DNA tested was a new kind of battle. It was a bureaucratic war against a system that had no interest in reopening a closed case. Bloodsworth wrote letter after letter, pleading with lawyers, innocence advocates, and the courts. His requests were met with resistance and indifference. DNA testing was new, expensive, and its validity in court was still being established. To the state, he was a convicted murderer grasping at straws. Years passed. His pleas were ignored. Then came a devastating blow. The victim's clothing, which held the bulk of the biological evidence, had been destroyed by the county clerk's office. It was a routine disposal of old evidence, but for Bloodsworth, it was the destruction of his only path to freedom. It seemed that his last hope was gone. But he refused to give up. He remembered from the trial testimony that a small piece of the evidence had been mounted on a microscope slide for examination by the original forensic analyst. He believed that slide might still exist, tucked away and forgotten in a laboratory evidence box. His new legal team, now convinced of his innocence, launched a desperate search. In 1992, after months of searching, they found it. In a dusty cardboard box in a courthouse storage room was a small glass slide containing a smear of the semen recovered from the crime scene 8 years prior. It was the last, tiny remnant of the physical truth of that day. The slide was sent to a pioneering private lab in California, one of the few places in the world capable of performing the new, more sensitive PCR-based DNA testing. The process was painstaking. The sample was minute. The world waited. Kirk Bloodsworth waited, his entire life hanging in the balance of a scientific procedure he had only read about in a book. The results came back in May of 1993. The DNA profile extracted from the evidence on the slide was compared to the DNA profile from a sample of Kirk Bloodsworth's blood. They did not match. It was a definitive, scientific exclusion. The DNA belonged to another unknown man. Kirk Bloodsworth was, without a shadow of a doubt, innocent. On June 28, 1993, after 9 years, 2 months, and 19 days in prison, 2 of those years spent on death row, Kirk Bloodsworth walked out of the Maryland penitentiary, a free man. He was the first American death row inmate to be exonerated by post-conviction DNA testing. The cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. He squinted into the sunlight, a man who had entered prison at 22 and was now leaving at 31. He had lost his youth, his marriage had dissolved under the strain, and his name was still, in the minds of many, synonymous with a horrific crime. Freedom was not an end to his ordeal, but the beginning of a new one. He had to learn to live again in a world that had moved on without him. He struggled with PTSD, with the psychological scars of his long and unjust incarceration. But he also had a new purpose. He became a tireless advocate for the wrongly convicted and a powerful voice against the death penalty. He had stood at the edge of the abyss, condemned by a flawed system, and had been pulled back by science. He knew, better than anyone, how thin the line was between an ordinary life and a wrongful conviction. The story, however, was still incomplete. A question lingered, haunting the case. If Kirk Bloodsworth was innocent, then who was the man whose DNA was on that slide? For a decade, the DNA profile of Don Hamilton's killer sat in an evidence file, an anonymous genetic ghost. In 2003, 10 years after Bloodsworth's exoneration, that DNA profile was entered into the newly established National DNA Database, CODIS. The system searched for a match among millions of profiles of convicted offenders. It found one. The DNA matched a man named Kimberly Shea Ruffner. The name was not new to the case. In 1984, during the original investigation, Ruffner had been a suspect. He had a prior criminal record for breaking and entering and assault. He lived just a short distance from the crime scene. He had even been questioned by police. But they had let him go. They had decided, for reasons that remain unclear, to focus their resources on the man from the anonymous tip, the man who looked like the sketch. At the time of the DNA match, Kimberly Ruffner was already in a Maryland prison, serving a 45-year sentence for the attempted murder and sexual assault of another young girl, a crime he had committed just 3 months after the murder of Don Hamilton. He had been a predator, hiding in their midst, and the system had looked right at him and let him walk away, choosing instead to pursue and convict an innocent man. Ruffner was charged with Don Hamilton's murder. He pleaded guilty in 2004 and was sentenced to another life term. The case was finally, truly closed. The wrongful conviction of Kirk Bloodsworth stands as a watershed moment in the history of American justice. It is a story of the catastrophic fallibility of the very evidence we are conditioned to trust the most, the memory of an eyewitness. It reveals how a vague sketch, a speculative phone call, and a series of suggestive police procedures can create a reality of their own, a reality powerful enough to send an innocent man to his death. Kirk Bloodsworth's journey from a death row cell to a life of advocacy is a testament to individual resilience, but his case is a permanent and chilling indictment of the system. It proves that what we see and what we remember is not always the truth, and that without objective, scientific evidence, justice can be blind not to prejudice, but to innocence itself. Case 3. Michael Morton. The Price of Silence. In the quiet calculus of married life, there are days that carry more weight than others. Birthdays, anniversaries, small anchors in the passage of time. For Michael Morton, August 13, 1986, was his 32nd birthday. The day began like any other. He rose early, leaving his wife, Christine, and their 3-year-old son, Eric, asleep in the quiet of their suburban home. He left a note on the bathroom counter, a simple, affectionate note, expressing his disappointment that they had not been able to be intimate the night before, but looking forward to celebrating that evening. He drove to work at the inventory control company where he was a manager, his mind on the mundane tasks of the day ahead. Michael Morton had no way of knowing that as his car pulled away from the curb, he was leaving behind not just his home, but the entire reality he had ever known. He was driving away from a life that, by the time the sun set, would be gone forever, replaced by a nightmare crafted from suspicion and silence. When Michael returned home that evening, he found the house unusually still. A profound and unsettling quiet had taken root. He called for Christine. No answer. He walked through the house, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. He noticed a large, blue suitcase propped against the bed, along with some of his wife's belongings, as if she had been interrupted while packing for a trip. In the master bedroom, the stillness was broken. He found Christine on the bed. She was lifeless, her body bearing the marks of a brutal and violent struggle. She had been bludgeoned to death. The Williamson County Sheriff's Department arrived, led by Sheriff Don Ramsey. The scene was one of contained chaos. There were signs of a struggle, but no clear signs of a forced entry. In the initial hours of a homicide investigation, detectives searched for a narrative, a simple story to explain an unspeakable act. And the simplest, most statistically common narrative is that the killer is the person closest to the victim, the husband. From the moment they arrived, their focus settled on Michael Morton. His shock, his quiet devastation, was interpreted through a lens of suspicion. Grief is a language with no single dialect. It manifests in 1,000 different ways. To the investigators, Michael's subdued demeanor was read not as the catatonia of trauma, but as a cold, calculating lack of emotion. He was not behaving like a grieving husband should. The birthday note he had left for his wife, an expression of casual intimacy, was twisted into a sinister artifact. The lead prosecutor on the case, Ken Anderson, began to build a theory. It was a theory born not from evidence, but from imagination. Anderson proposed that Michael Morton, enraged that his wife had refused his sexual advances on the eve of his birthday, had beaten her to death in a fit of pique. He then, the theory went, staged a robbery and went to work, pretending to be none the wiser. This narrative had a fatal flaw. There was not a single piece of physical evidence to support it. No blood on Michael's clothing. No fingerprints out of place. No weapon linked to him. The case against him was purely circumstantial, built on the rickety foundation of a perceived motive and his unemotional reaction. But in the hands of a determined prosecutor, a compelling story can often be more persuasive to a jury than a lack of facts. What Michael Morton and his defense team did not know was that the investigators and the prosecutor were in possession of evidence that did more than just fail to support their theory. It actively dismantled it, and they chose to conceal it. This was not a passive oversight. It was an active, deliberate decision to bury the truth in order to secure a conviction. This is known as a Brady violation, the illegal withholding of exculpatory evidence by the prosecution. In the case of Michael Morton, it was not a single violation but a systemic pattern of suppression. The first, and perhaps most heartbreaking, piece of hidden evidence came from the mouth of the only eyewitness to the crime, Michael's 3-year-old son, Eric. In the days following his mother's murder, Eric was interviewed by his grandmother, Christine's mother. The boy, in the simple, unvarnished language of a child, described what he had seen. He said that a monster had hurt his mommy. He said the monster was not his father. And he said, crucially, that Daddy was not home. This account was documented in a police transcript. It was direct, powerful evidence that corroborated Michael's alibi and pointed to an unknown intruder. Prosecutor Ken Anderson and Sheriff Don Ramsey were aware of this transcript. They knew what the child had said. They made the choice to bury it, to never disclose its existence to Michael Morton's defense team. The second piece of hidden evidence came from a neighbor. Shortly after the murder, a neighbor informed the police that she had seen a man in a green van parked on the street near the Morton home on several occasions in the days leading up to the killing. She had seen him get out and walk into the wooded area behind the house. This was a clear indication of a potential stalker, a third party who had been watching the house. This information, too, was documented in a police report. And this report, too, was concealed. The third piece of hidden evidence was a clear trail leading away from the Morton home. Christine Morton's credit card had been stolen. It was used the day after her murder at a gift shop in San Antonio, 100 miles away. A sales clerk signed an affidavit stating that a woman had forged Christine's signature to make a purchase. This pointed to a robbery committed by someone other than Michael. The police had this information. The prosecution knew about it. It was never turned over to the defense. And then there was the most significant piece of physical evidence. A search of the area behind the Morton home, the same wooded area where the neighbor had seen the man from the green van, yielded a critical discovery. A bloody bandana. It was found just 100 yards from the house. It was stained with what appeared to be blood, clearly related to the violent crime that had just occurred. This bandana was evidence of a third party, the real killer, who had fled the scene. The police collected it, tagged it as evidence, and then, effectively, made it disappear. Its existence was not mentioned in any report provided to the defense. It was hidden away in an evidence locker, a silent, cloth-bound testament to Michael Morton's innocence. The trial of Michael Morton began in February of 1987. The prosecution, led by Ken Anderson, presented its narrative of a spurned husband's rage. They paraded friends and family to the stand, asking them about the state of the Mortons' marriage, searching for any hint of discord that could be magnified into a motive for murder. They used Michael's own grief against him, painting him as a cold, unfeeling man. The defense was fighting a ghost. They had no idea that the prosecutor was holding a handful of Ace's the Child statement, the neighbor's sighting, the stolen credit card, the bloody bandana. They argued that the state had no real evidence, that their case was pure speculation. But they could not present the evidence of a third-party intruder because they had been kept in the dark. The jury was only given one story, the one crafted by Ken Anderson. The jury deliberated. They found Michael Morton guilty of the murder of his wife. He was sentenced to life in prison. As he was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his life in ruins, he passed by Ken Anderson. Morton looked at the prosecutor and said, "I hope you're proud of yourself. You've just convicted an innocent man." Prison is a world designed to strip away identity. For Michael Morton, it also stripped away his role as a father. His son, Eric, was raised by Christine's sister and her husband. They loved the boy, but they believed, as the jury had, that his father was a monster. Over the years, they told Eric that his father had killed his mother. Michael's letters from prison were returned, unopened. His requests for visits were denied. He lost his wife, his freedom, and his son, all in one fell swoop. For nearly 25 years, Michael Morton existed in the gray twilight of a Texas prison. He maintained his innocence, but his voice was a whisper against the roar of the state's final verdict. He missed his son's childhood, his graduations, his life. He read the Bible, found a measure of peace and faith, and held onto the sliver of hope that one day, the truth would emerge. That hope began to take a tangible form in the 2000s, with the advent of sophisticated DNA testing. In 2005, a pro bono legal team, including lawyers from the New York-based Innocence Project, took on Michael's case. They filed a request to have the biological evidence from the crime scene tested. Specifically, they wanted to test the bloody bandana, which they had learned about years later through an offhand comment during an old interview. The request set off a legal battle that would last for 6 years. The opposition was led by the man who had originally prosecuted the case, Ken Anderson, who is now a respected district court judge. Anderson and the Williamson County District Attorney's Office fought the request at every turn. They argued that the evidence was irrelevant. They claimed that the bandana could not be found, that it had been lost. They used every legal maneuver possible to prevent the truth from being tested. The system was not just passively resisting, It was actively fighting to protect its original conviction, even at the potential cost of an innocent man's life. The legal battle was a war of attrition. Michael Morton's lawyers were relentless. They refused to accept that the evidence was lost. Finally, in 2011, after a judge threatened the district attorney with contempt of court, the bandana was suddenly found in a locked evidence box. It had been there all along. The court ordered it to be tested. The sample was sent to a lab. Scientists extracted 2 distinct DNA profiles from the bandana. One profile came from the blood of the victim, Christine Morton. The other profile, presumably from the sweat or skin cells of the killer, belonged to an unknown male. That male was not Michael Morton. This was the scientific proof of his innocence, the irrefutable biological fact that another man was at the crime scene. On October 4, 2011, after spending 24 years, 10 months, and 19 days in prison for a crime he did not commit, Michael Morton's conviction was overturned. He walked out of the courthouse a free man. He was 57 years old. His first embrace was with his parents, who had never lost faith in him. Later, he met with his son, Eric. The young man who had been raised to hate him now knew the truth. He looked at his father and said, "I'm so sorry." In that moment, a bond that had been severed by a lie began to mend. But the story did not end with Michael's freedom. The DNA profile from the bandana was run through the National Codes database. It hit a match. The DNA belonged to a man named Mark Allen Norwood, a career criminal with a long history of violent offenses. He was a dishwasher who had lived in the Austin area in 1986. The truth of what happened on that August morning was finally clear. Norwood, a stranger, had broken into the Morton home to burglarize it, and when Christine confronted him, he had beaten her to death. The investigation into Mark Allen Norwood uncovered a second, even more chilling tragedy. In 1988, just a year and a half after Michael Morton was sent to prison, a young mother named Deborah Masters Baker was bludgeoned to death in her bed in Austin, just a few miles from the Morton home. The crime was eerily similar. The case had gone unsolved for decades. Police tested DNA from the Baker crime scene. It matched Mark Allen Norwood. The implication was staggering and horrific. The decision by Ken Anderson and the Williamson County Sheriff's Office to conceal the evidence of Michael Morton's innocence had not just cost one man his freedom. It had left a serial killer on the streets, free to take another life. Deborah Masters Baker's death was the direct, foreseeable consequence of a system's failure, the price of silence. Mark Allen Norwood was convicted of both murders and is now serving a life sentence. For the first time in American history, a prosecutor was held criminally accountable for a wrongful conviction. Ken Anderson, the man who built his career on Michael Morton's conviction, was charged with contempt of court and tampering with evidence for deliberately hiding the documents that would have proven Morton's innocence. He was disbarred, stripped of his law license, and served a mere 10 days in jail. A small price to pay for the quarter-century he had stolen from an innocent man and the life of a second victim. Michael Morton's ordeal led to the passage of the Michael Morton Act in Texas in 2013. This landmark legislation reformed the state's discovery laws, requiring prosecutors to maintain an open-file policy, turning over all evidence to the defense, whether it is incriminating or exculpatory. The case of Michael Morton is a harrowing study in the corruption of power. It demonstrates that a wrongful conviction is not always the result of a simple mistake, a misidentified suspect, or a flawed forensic science. Sometimes, it is the result of a deliberate choice. A choice to value a conviction over justice, a career over a life, and silence over the truth. It is a reminder that the most dangerous weapon in the justice system is not a piece of evidence, but the willingness of those in power to conceal it. Case 4. Ronald Cotton, The Peril of Memory. In the architecture of memory, some nights are load-bearing walls. They are the foundations upon which the rest of a life is built, or from which it collapses. For Jennifer Thompson, a 22-year-old college student, the night of July 28, 1984, was such a moment. She was asleep in her bed, in the presumed sanctuary of her off-campus apartment, when the quiet was broken by the sound of a screen being sliced and a lock being turned. A man slipped through her window and into her life, a shadow carrying with him an atmosphere of pure menace. He held a knife to her throat. He told her if she screamed, he would kill her. For the next hour, he subjected her to a brutal sexual assault. In the midst of this terror, a moment that would understandably cause a mind to shut down or fragment, Jennifer Thompson made a conscious and deliberate decision. She was a survivor, and she would ensure that the man who was doing this to her would be held accountable. She decided she would study him. She would burn his face into her mind. She would memorize the texture of his hair, the shape of his nose, the sound of his voice, the feel of his skin. Every detail he allowed her to see, she committed to memory with a fierce, desperate focus. This was not just a violation, it was an intelligence-gathering mission. She was actively creating the evidence that would convict him. She was determined to be the perfect witness. When he finally left, slipping back out into the North Carolina night, he left behind a shattered sense of safety, but also a witness armed with a memory she believed was as infallible as a photograph. Jennifer went to the police. She was calm, methodical. She provided a detailed description of her attacker. He was a black man in his mid-20s, with a specific hairstyle and facial features. From her description, a police artist created a composite sketch. The sketch was circulated. The investigation began. In the small world of Burlington, the sketch triggered a connection. A police detective was talking with a local informant about unrelated matters when the sketch came up. The informant mentioned that the drawing looked a bit like a man named Ronald Cotton. It was a casual observation, a speculative link. But it was enough. Ronald Cotton became a person of interest. The police compiled a photographic lineup. It consisted of several photographs of black men, including one of Ronald Cotton. They brought Jennifer Thompson to the station. She sat at a table. The photos spread before her. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment her memorization would pay off. She studied the faces. The process was not immediate. She narrowed her choice down to 2 photographs. One was Ronald Cotton. The other was a different man. She hesitated for several minutes, the memory she thought was so clear now showing its human fallibility. Finally, she pointed to Ronald Cotton's picture. But she was not completely certain. She turned to the detective in the room and asked a question that would unknowingly alter the course of 2 lives. "Did I do okay?" she asked. "Did I pick the right one?" The detective, likely believing he was offering reassurance to a traumatized victim, responded, "Yes, that's the one we thought it was." In that single moment of confirmation, the fragile, uncertain memory of Jennifer Thompson began to harden. The doubt vanished, replaced by the cement of official validation. The system had told her she was right. Her memory was no longer just her own. It was now a shared fact, endorsed by the authorities. The image of Ronald Cotton was no longer a possibility, it was the truth. A week later, the police conducted a live lineup. Ronald Cotton stood on a stage with 6 other men. There was a critical and common procedural flaw in this lineup. Of all the men in the live lineup, Ronald Cotton was the only one whose face Jennifer had also seen in the photographic array. The procedure was not a fresh test of her memory. It was a test of her ability to recognize the man whose picture the police had already confirmed for her. She looked at the men on the stage. She saw Ronald Cotton. The last vestiges of her earlier hesitation were gone.
She pointed to him.
"I'm positive," she said. "That is the man." The confidence in her voice was absolute. Ronald Cotton was arrested and charged with rape and burglary. He was innocent, but he was trapped in a nightmare from which he could not awaken. His alibi, the testimony of his own family, was dismissed as biased. The state had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Semen samples had been collected from the rape kit, but in 1984, the technology to perform precise DNA matching did not exist. The forensic science of the time could only determine that the perpetrator had the same blood type as approximately 40% of the male population, a group that included Ronald Cotton. It was evidence that was inclusive, but far from definitive. The prosecution's case rested entirely on a single pillar: the unwavering, confident, and profoundly compelling testimony of Jennifer Thompson. The trial took place in early 1985. When Jennifer Thompson took the stand, she was the prosecution's star witness. She was articulate, poised, and sympathetic. She looked directly at Ronald Cotton, pointed her finger, and identified him as the man who had climbed through her window and destroyed her life. She recounted the assault in detail and then described how she had deliberately studied his face. To the jury, her certainty was undeniable. It seemed impossible that a victim who had gone to such lengths to remember could be wrong. Ronald Cotton's defense attorney could only argue that she was mistaken. But how do you cross-examine a memory? How do you create reasonable doubt against a witness whose sincerity and trauma are so painfully apparent? The jury believed her. They found Ronald Cotton guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. In that courtroom, two people believed, with every fiber of their being, that justice had been done. Jennifer Thompson believed she had successfully put her rapist behind bars, fulfilling the mission she had set for herself on that terrible night. And the jury believed they had convicted a guilty man based on the most powerful evidence imaginable. Only one person in the room knew it was all a catastrophic mistake: Ronald Cotton. He was sent to North Carolina's Central Prison, a world of concrete and steel populated by the guilty. He insisted on his innocence, but in prison, every man has a story. His was just one more voice in a chorus of denial. In 1987, 2 years into his sentence, something strange happened. Ronald Cotton was transferred to a different prison. There, he encountered another inmate who other prisoners kept confusing for him. The man's name was Bobby Poole. The physical resemblance between the two men was uncanny. They had similar features, a similar build. It was more than a passing likeness. They could have been brothers. Then the whispers started. In the closed-off world of a prison yard, secrets have a way of surfacing. Bobby Poole, a man with a history of similar crimes, began to brag to other inmates. He boasted that he was the one who had raped the college student in Burlington. He laughed about the fact that another man, Ronald Cotton, was serving his time for it. For Cotton, this was a bombshell. This was the proof, the name and face of the man who had actually committed the crime. He desperately tried to get the authorities to listen. He told his lawyers. He filed motions. He had found the real killer, and the man was sleeping in a cell just down the hall. The system, however, was unmoved. It had already solved the case. It had a conviction. It had the unshakable testimony of the victim. The idea that they had made such a colossal error was one the system was not prepared to entertain. Ronald Cotton's pleas were ignored. But a small legal victory gave him a sliver of hope. His conviction was overturned on a technicality in issue with how the two separate charges had been handled. He was granted a new trial. This, he believed, would be his chance. He could finally present the evidence of Bobby Poole. The truth would come out. The second trial was a surreal spectacle. This time, the defense had a secret weapon. During Jennifer Thompson's testimony, they called a surprise witness to the stand, Bobby Poole. He walked into the courtroom, and a murmur went through the gallery. The resemblance to Cotton was striking. The defense attorney asked Jennifer Thompson to look at the two men. At the defense table sat Ronald Cotton, the man she had identified twice. On the witness stand sat Bobby Poole, the man now implicated by his own boasts. This was the moment of truth. Two faces. One memory. Jennifer looked at Bobby Poole. Her expression was blank. She studied his face and then said, with complete conviction, "I have never seen this man before in my life." Then she turned and looked at Ronald Cotton. The certainty returned, stronger than ever. "He is the one," she said, her voice unwavering. "I have no doubt." In that moment, the power of a contaminated memory was laid bare. Her initial, hesitant identification had been reinforced by police confirmation, then by the suggestive lineup, then by the act of testifying at the first trial, then by the passage of years. Her memory of Ronald Cotton's face had completely and totally overwritten the original, fuzzy image of her attacker. She was not lying. She was stating a truth that her own mind had manufactured. She was testifying from a script that the system itself had helped her write. The jury, once again faced with the powerful testimony of the victim, believed her. Ronald Cotton was convicted for a second time. His sentence of life, plus 50 years, was reinstated. He was sent back to prison, his last hope extinguished. Years crawled by. Ronald Cotton resigned himself to dying in prison. But science was evolving. The same DNA technology that had exonerated Kirk Bloodsworth was becoming more refined. In 1994, Cotton's new appellate lawyers, who believed in his innocence, filed a motion to have the biological evidence from Jennifer Thompson's rape kit tested. After a legal fight, the court agreed. Samples of DNA from the semen recovered from the crime scene were compared with DNA samples from both Ronald Cotton and Bobby Poole. The results were delivered in the spring of 1995. The DNA from the crime scene did not match Ronald Cotton. It was a definitive, scientific exclusion. He was innocent. The DNA did, however, provide a perfect match to one other person, Bobby Poole. The truth, buried for over a decade under the weight of a flawed memory and a complacent system, had finally been unearthed by science. On June 30th, 1995, after serving 10.5 years in prison, Ronald Cotton was officially exonerated and released. The news was a devastating blow to Jennifer Thompson. She had built a part of her identity around being the woman who had survived and put her attacker in prison. To learn that she had been wrong, that her memory had betrayed her so completely, and that she had been the instrument of an innocent man suffering, sent her into a spiral of guilt and depression. The monster she had feared for a decade was not the man she had identified. The man she had pointed to, the man whose life she had helped destroy, was innocent. 2 years after his release, in an act of extraordinary grace, Ronald Cotton agreed to meet Jennifer Thompson. They met in a small room, two people whose lives had been irrevocably and tragically intertwined by a mistake. She apologized, tears streaming down her face. He looked at her, and he forgave her. From that meeting, an unlikely and powerful friendship was born. Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson began to travel the country together, sharing their story. They became advocates for criminal justice reform, speaking about the profound unreliability of eyewitness testimony. Their story is not one of a malicious witness or corrupt police. It is a more subtle and, perhaps, more terrifying story. It is a cautionary tale about the very nature of memory itself, how it is not a video recording, but a fragile, malleable thing that can be contaminated, altered, and rebuilt without our knowledge. The system did not just fail Ronald Cotton. It failed Jennifer Thompson. It took her trauma and her sincere desire for justice and used it to validate a mistake, reinforcing a false memory until it became an unshakable truth. Her case reveals that the most dangerous witness is not the one who is uncertain, but the one who is absolutely, breathtakingly, and tragically sure they are right. The visual fades to black. A moment of silence. Then a slow, gentle piano melody begins to play. The text, "In memory of all victims," appears on screen. Narrator. The stories we have shared tonight are not anomalies. They are stark reminders that the systems we construct to protect us are designed and operated by human beings, and are therefore inherently flawed. They are echoes of lives interrupted, of years stolen by misplaced certainty and institutional inertia. For every person exonerated, we are left to wonder about those whose innocence remains a secret, buried in a forgotten file or a fallible memory. The pursuit of justice must be a pursuit of truth, relentless and humble, always willing to question its own conclusions. Good night.